All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be tackling some seriously mind-bending stuff. We're talking about George Berkeley, the philosopher, who basically said, hey, what if reality is all in our heads?
Berkeley really isn't afraid to dive into those truly deep questions that have philosophers scratching their heads even today. Like, what's the nature of reality? How do we know anything at all? And what role do our minds actually play in, constructing the world that we experience?
I mean, he's the guy who gave us to be is to be perceived, right?
Yeah.
That's some seriously heavy stuff, and we're going to try to unpack all of that today using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Berkeley.
Yeah, so we're talking deep dive, not just skimming the surface. We'll be looking at his arguments against materialism,
Yeah.
how he builds his case for idealism, and of course the, shall we say, interesting role he gives to God in all of this.
So just to give everyone some historical context, we're in the 18th century. This is a time when, the old ways of thinking about the world are being totally shaken up by the rise of science. Think Newton, Locke, all that emphasis on observation and reason.
And Berkeley's right there in the thick of it. But he's deeply skeptical of this view that's gaining popularity, materialism, this idea that matter, the stuff out there, exists totally independent of our minds and is like the foundation of everything. Berkeley thought that led to a whole bunch of problems.
I mean, he saw it as a slippery slope towards skepticism and even atheism. He wasn't afraid to call out some big names like John Locke.
Yeah, Locke was all about this idea that we perceive the world indirectly through these ideas that represent mind-independent material objects.
And Berkeley was like, hold up. How can an idea, which exists in the mind, resemble something that's supposed to be totally outside the mind?
Right. It just doesn't make sense. Like, saying a thought can have the same texture as a rock.
So that's where his famous likeness principle comes in. Right?
Yeah.
He basically argued that ideas can only resemble other ideas. So the whole notion that our ideas are these perfect copies of a material world, well, it just crumbles.
And what's really clever about Berkeley's argument is that he's using the very tools of representationalism, this idea that we perceive the world through representations, to completely undermine the whole materialist project.
So he's basically saying if all we ever experience is ideas, how can we ever truly know if there's anything beyond them? And if we can't know it, why even bother believing it?
And he doesn't stop there. He also points out that even if we accept that matter exists, we still can't really explain how it gives rise to our ideas in the first place. It's that classic mind-body problem that's been bugging philosophers forever. Like, how does inert, unthinking matter produce conscious experience?
Yeah, it's a tough one. So Berkeley's looking at all this, and he's saying, if matter doesn't actually explain our experience, and we can't even be sure it exists, then what's the point of even talking about it?
It's like trying to put together a puzzle when you're missing half the pieces. You just end up with this jumbled mess. And that's where Berkeley's big alternative comes in. Idealism.
This is where it gets really interesting, especially for a philosopher like you. Instead of a world made up of matter, Berkeley's proposing a world made entirely of minds and the ideas those minds have. To be is to be perceived, or as he put it in Latin, esse est percipi.
Now, before everyone dismisses this as completely bonkers, we have to remember Berkeley wasn't saying that the world around us is an illusion.
He wasn't saying your chair doesn't exist. He was changing what it actually means for that chair to exist.
Exactly. For Berkeley, that chair, the trees outside, everything, they all exist as collections of ideas in minds. Your mind, my mind, and ultimately the mind of God.
Okay, wait, God. I think that's where we need pause for. We'll dive into the role of God in Berkeley's system and how he addresses some of the, let's say, trickier implications of idealism in the next part of our deep dive.
So last time we were talking about this idea that for Berkeley, reality is basically a world of ideas existing in minds. And I'm sure for a philosopher like you, this raises some pretty big questions, right? Like, what happens when no one's looking? Does the world just poof, disappear?
Yeah, that was a major challenge for Berkeley, right? If every time I close my eyes, everything just vanishes, that's a bit, well, inconvenient to say the least.
It is. And Berkeley himself realized that his earlier explanations, saying things have the potential to be perceived, weren't really a satisfying answer. So he brings in something that's sure to get people talking.
God.
Okay, so God's like the cosmic observer who keeps everything running even when we're not looking. Sort of like a 204/7 reality show camera crew for the entire universe.
That's a fun way to think about it. But for Berkeley, it's deeper than that. God's not just passively watching. God's the ultimate perceiver, the mind in which all these ideas exist, constantly and continuously.
So God's like the container for the entire universe of perceptions. That's a pretty big job. It is. And this actually helps Berkeley answer some other tricky questions too. Like, how do things stay consistent? Why does the world seem to follow laws and patterns?
Because God's the one keeping things in order, like the divine rule maker.
Right. The laws of nature, for Berkeley, they're not like built into some material world. They're expressions of God's will. It's how God chooses to order our perceptions.
So it's because of God that the world makes sense, that it's intelligible to us.
Exactly. It reflects the mind of God. But, if we're talking about God's will and how that shapes everything, that brings up another big question, doesn't it? What about free will?
Yeah, if God's ultimately causing everything, are we just puppets in some cosmic play? Where's the room for our own choices?
Ah, that's a really important point. And it's something Berkeley thought a lot about. He was very clear that his system actually preserves free will.
Okay, but how? If God's the ultimate cause, where do we get any say in things?
For Berkeley, our freedom comes in how we respond to God's will. We're not robots just blindly following orders. We have the power to choose, to align ourselves with that divine order or to resist it.
So God sets the stage, but we still get to write our own lines.
That's a good analogy. And this gets us to another fascinating part of Berkeley's thinking. Remember how we talked about him rejecting material causation?
Yeah, the idea that matter, just unthinking stuff, could somehow cause anything to happen.
Yeah.
Especially something as complex as, thought.
Right. So for Berkeley, all causation ultimately comes from minds. God's the primary cause, of course, but we, as finite spirits, we also have this limited causal power.
So when I decide to pick up my coffee cup, it's not just my brain firing neurons. It's my mind working together with God's will and the laws of nature that makes that action happen in my world of perceptions.
You got it. And see how this shifts our focus. Instead of getting stuck trying to explain how matter can cause mind, Berkeley's asking us to think about the world as this dynamic interaction of minds and ideas.
It's like a cosmic dance, right? God's leading, but we're still contributing our own steps. But if everything is ideas, where does that leave us? Our sense of self. Do we have an idea of ourselves?
Now, that is a question that really gets to the heart of Berkeley's system. It's where he brings in this idea of introspection, of turning our mental gaze inwards.
So if we can't have an idea, our own mind, in the same way we have ideas of, like a tree or a song, how do we even know ourselves? It's like, where's the me in all of this?
It is a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it? And it really gets to the core of what it means to be a self, especially in Berkeley's system. He argued that we don't grasp our minds through some sort of mental picture, but through our activity, the very act of thinking, willing, and perceiving.
So it's not like there's this mini me in my head. It's more like me is all this mental action, all these thoughts and feelings going on.
That's a great way to put it. You experience yourself as this center of mental activity, this constant flow of, thoughts, feelings, choices. And for Berkeley, that's actually a much richer and more accurate way of understanding the self than just seeing it as some static, unchanging thing.
It's like me is a verb, not a noun. Always becoming, not just being.
Exactly. And this active, dynamic view of the self, it has some pretty big implications. Because if the self is made up of its activity, then our actions, our choices, they take on a whole new significance.
They're not just things happening in some isolated mind, right? They're actually shaping who we are, contributing to, the creation of ourselves.
Absolutely. It's not just that we have free will in Berkeley's system, but that our free choices are essential to the very process of becoming who we are. And this brings us back to the moral dimension of his thinking. Because for Berkeley, our choices aren't just random whims.
Right, because we talked about how the world is ultimately grounded in the mind of God.
Right.
So our actions are happening within this larger framework of divine order.
But he's not saying we're blindly following a script. We have a genuine ability to choose to align ourselves with God's will or to resist it.
So there are real consequences to our decisions. They matter not just for us, but for the way we fit into this bigger, divinely orchestrated reality.
And for a philosopher like you, I think this opens up a whole new set of questions, right?
Yeah.
How does moral responsibility work in a world where everything is ultimately rooted in God's mind?
Yeah, it's like ethics is woven into the very fabric of reality itself, not just some human invention. It really makes you think, if we took Berkeley's idealism seriously, how would that change the way we understand good and evil, right and wrong?
Big questions indeed. And Berkeley doesn't necessarily give us all the answers, but he provides a way of thinking about them that challenges our usual assumptions. And, even with all this talk of God and spirits, Berkeley was a strong advocate for empirical observation and science.
It's almost like he's building a bridge between these two worlds, the spiritual and the scientific.
Exactly. He wasn't happy with a purely mechanistic view that reduced everything to just matter and motion, but he also wasn't interested in a kind of blind faith that rejected reason and observation.
He saw the laws of nature, these patterns we see in the world, as expressions of God's wisdom and goodness, like God is communicating with us through the language of science.
And I think that's what makes Berkeley still relevant today, even centuries later. He pushes us to think outside the box, to see how our minds are involved in shaping the reality we experience, and to recognize the deep moral significance of everything we do.
It's definitely a mind-bending journey, but one that can open up whole new ways of seeing the world and our place in it.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Berkeley's idealism, I'm left with this thought. If to be is to be perceived really holds true, and the world is this grand, divinely orchestrated symphony of perceptions, what does that mean for the search for truth? Is truth something fixed and absolute, or is it something constantly evolving, shaped by the interplay of minds?
That's a great question to end on. It seems Berkeley's philosophy, even after all these years, still has the power to challenge us, make us rethink some of our most basic assumptions about reality, knowledge, and even ourselves. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.